Greetings and welcome back to the No Channel. This is Bernadette Johnson, and some of you know me as Keziah or Kizzy. And today we're going to be talking about, as indicated in the title, Joshua and Caleb. Now, those of you who are familiar with the scriptures, especially the Old Testament, you are very familiar with these figures. Caleb, Joshua, Joshua and Caleb, they played very key roles and prominent roles when the children of Israel was making their exodus from Egypt to the promised land. And Joshua and Caleb, they were the, two mighty men of battle, great warriors. And they were also two of the 12 men of each of the 12 tribes. It was one man from that was sent from each of the 12 tribes of Israel to spy out the land of Canaan. That was a land, of course, that Yah promised to give to the children of Israel once they left Egypt. And they were two of the 12 sent to spy out the land. And now the 10 of those 12 brought back an evil report. Because see, they went to the land of Canaan, they saw these great giants, these mighty men, and they came back. We returned to the multitude and saying, oh, we can't fight those men. Those men are mighty, they're powerful. We can't overcome them. And so, and of course, and that caused the multitude and to become upset, and they went into a panic and everything. However, Joshua and Caleb said, we are more than able. We're more than able to conquer the land. So they were the two of the 12 that had the great faith. And so, and as it indicates in the title, it says, not a man of them save Caleb and Joshua, which takes me to the common narrative that those of us who are familiar with the story of the Exodus, and where the children of Israel, as if you read the book of Exodus, how they rebelled against Moses, they rebelled against the Most High, and as punishment, Yah did not allow the generation that was in Egypt to enter into the promised land, except for Caleb and Joshua. So I don't know about you, but I was always taught that Joshua and Caleb were the only two of that generation to come out, that were in the land of Egypt and to come out. Those who were in the land of Egypt and came out, they were the only two of that generation that entered into the promised land. The rest of them died in the wilderness. So that was what I was taught, and I always found that very, very interesting, how they were the only two of a whole multitude of about 2 million people. I mean, a multitude, and they were the only two of that generation. So let's go to the verse that talks about that. So we're going to go to Numbers chapter 32, verse 13. So let's read. And the Lord's anger. Now I'm going to be reading out of the King James Version. So that's why it reads this way. And the Lord's anger was kindled against Israel, and he made them wander in the wilderness 40 years, until all the generation that had done evil in the sight of the Lord was consumed. Now we're going to return to this verse near the end of this lesson. So keep this verse in mind. So now let's continue, because see, this was mentioned more than once, how God's Lord's anger was so kindled against Israel, because Israel was always murmuring and grumbling and complaining against Moses and all. And then he was just so fed up with them that he just said, no, you're not going to make it into the promised land. You're going to wander in this wilderness until all of you die off. And then the newer generation that came after you, they're the ones that are going to enter into the promised land. Okay, so let's continue. All right, and there's another verse. This is Numbers 26, verses 64 through 65. It reads, but among these that was not of a man of them. Okay, let me go back. I stumbled too much. Let me go back. But among these there was not a man of them whom Moses and Aaron the priests numbered, when they numbered the children of Israel in the wilderness of Sinai. For the Lord said of them, they shall surely die in the wilderness. And there was not a man of them save Caleb the son of Jephunneh and Joshua the son of Nun. So there it goes again. Those were the only two of that generation that was saved and that went into the promised land. All the rest died. Okay, now let's continue. Now this one is in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verses 35 through 39. And it reads, surely there shall not one of these men of this evil generation see that good land, which I swear to give unto your fathers, save Caleb, the son of Jephunneh. He shall see it, and to him will I give the land that he hath trodden upon, and to his children, because he hath wholly followed the Lord. Also the Lord was angered with me for your sake, saying, thou shalt not go in thither. So if you was wondering, this is Moses speaking. But Joshua, the son of Nun, so this was Joshua. Caleb was mentioned in the first verse, paragraph, and now this is Joshua. But Joshua, the son of Nun, which standeth before thee, he shall go in thither. Encourage him, for he shall cause Israel to inherit it. Moreover, your little ones, which ye shall be a prey, and your children, in which in that day have no knowledge between good and evil, they shall go in thither, and unto them will I give it, and they shall possess it. So this was Moses speaking, and this was the Most High speaking. So there it goes again, where it's mentioned in a few places, several places, where Caleb and Joshua were the only two out of that evil generation that entered into the promised land. And when I was read about this story, and of course I was in church, so of course I was very familiar with the Bible, and would hear this story a lot, and how it was taught that entire generation, save two, perished in the wilderness. That's how I was taught. They all perished in the wilderness. Now this is the same generation that underwent slavery and oppression in Egypt. I mean, they suffered all of that toil. They were brought out only to die in the wilderness. And that really bothered me. And then as a child, I, was shown the movie The Ten Commandments. And it was showing how the people was oppressed. Of course, the Ten Commandments, the popular Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston and Yul Brynner. Of course, we know that's not how the Israelites really look. But with that, putting that aside, I'm just focusing on the narrative. And I would look at that and see how they was oppressed, how they were beaten down and whipped, only to die in the wilderness. They were freed, and only to die in the wilderness. And being taught that Joshua and Caleb are only two saved. So they were the oldest two of that whole multitude that entered into the promised land. And as I said, this just bothered me. And but the Ten Commandments, it was one of my favorite movies. So that's why I always took an interest in this story. But what if I told you that this narrative of Caleb and Joshua being the only two of their generation to enter into the promised land was false? What if I told you that was it's not true? They were not the only two of their generation to enter into the promised land. And I'm going to prove it to you today. So let's proceed. Let's go to Joshua chapter 5, verses 4 through 6. And it reads, and this is the cause why Joshua did circumcise all the people that came out of Egypt that were males, even all the men of war, and I have men of war in all caps and underlined for a reason, which I'll explain, died in the wilderness by the way, after they came out of Egypt. Now, all the people that came out were circumcised, males, of course, but all the people that were born in the wilderness by the way as they came forth out of Egypt, they had not circumcised. For the children of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness, till all the people that were men of war, which came out of Egypt, were consumed, because they obeyed not the voice of the Lord, or Yahuwah, or Yah, or, whatever name you use, unto whom the Lord swear that he would not show them the land, which the Lord sware unto their fathers, that he would give us a land that floweth with milk and honey. Okay, let's go to the next passage. This is Deuteronomy chapter 2, verses 14 through 16. And it reads, "And the space in which we came from Kadesh Barnea until we were come over the brook Zered was 38 years, until all the generation of the men of war were wasted out from among the host, as the Lord sware unto them. For indeed the hand of the Lord was against them, to destroy them from among the hosts until they were consumed. And it came to pass, when all the men of war were consumed and dead from among the people." And I stopped it right there, because that was, the point had been made, that all it was the men of war. As you can see, it was only the men of war of the generation that died. So no, not the whole entire generation that Joshua and Caleb were a part of. They didn't all perish in the wilderness. It was just those who were the men of war. Joshua and Caleb, of course, were mighty men of battle. They were men of war. So it was just the men of war of the generation that perished into the wilderness. So actually, when I could see, it was some years ago, I was listening to a Shabbat lesson, and a brother was teaching us a Shabbat lesson, and that was being discussed. And that's when I learned that it was not the entire generation, save two, that perished into the wilderness. It was just the men of war of that generation that perished into the wilderness. And now, this is just, my understanding. I'll go and explain. I'm going to explain a little later why it was just the men of war. But before I do that, I want to go back to the first verse that I read in this message. Now let's go back to Numbers 32:13. "And the Lord's anger was kindled against Israel, and he made them wander in the wilderness 40 years, until all the generation that had done evil in the sight of the Lord was consumed." So there it is right there. I have the last part underlined. There it is right there now. Now this was a verse that those people would say that all the generations, see, and they start right here. All the generation. But it continues to say that had done evil in the sight of the Lord. So that's showing you that whole entire generation, save two, did not perish in the wilderness. It was those that had done evil. And of that generation that had done evil, it was the men of war. And as I said, I'll explain later on why I believe that Yah judged the men of war the way he did. Because I'm pretty sure that they were not the only ones who, angered the Most High, but they were wiped out. The men of war of the generation of Joshua and Caleb and older, I guess, they were wiped out. Okay, so now I want to further prove that Joshua and Caleb were not the only of their generation that entered into the promised land. Now this is in Judges 2:7, and it reads, "And the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders that outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great works of the Lord that he did for Israel." Now, this outlived, normally The elders that outlived Joshua, so that means show there were elders to go into the promised land too. Now, when people say that someone outlived someone, outlive is usually someone who's the same age as that person or older than that person. I mean, you wouldn't normally say that a child outlived their parents, because that's typically how the child would typically outlive their parent. But when one say outlive, it's usually meaning someone who's that's around the same age as that person or older. So that I would see this as also proof to show that there were men of that generation of Caleb and Joshua to enter into the promised land. And I say the men of war, not all the men in the nation of Israel were men of war or fought the wars. Not all the men could, go to battle. There had to be someone behind to protect the rest of the people, the women and the children and their land and whatever, they own, their possessions. So not all of the men went to war. So it was just a certain percentage of the men in the nation of Israel who fought the war. So it was just only a certain segment of that generation that died in the wilderness. However many, I don't know, but it was just a segment. So I had to unlearn the narrative that I was taught, that all that generation except for Joshua and Caleb perished in the wilderness. Now I'm gonna expound upon the men of war. Why did Yah judge the men of war the way he did? Why did he not allow the men of war, save Caleb and Joshua, to enter into the promised land? Why he was so angry at them? Now this is my understanding. Men are the protectors of his family. The man is the first line of defense. The men primarily fight the wars. So they're that protector. So when that man is destroyed, that nation or that household is vulnerable to the invaders, is vulnerable to attackers, is vulnerable to predators, or those who seek to steal and rob and kill. So that man and of course the men of war were held to a very high standard. And if you think about it, think about a nation. A nation is the strength of a nation, the mind of a nation is determined by the strength of its economy and its military might. The strength of its economy and its military. So if that nation doesn't have a strong military, that nation is very, very vulnerable. So the men of war was a strength of the nation. So Yah knew that the men of war had to be strong in faith like a Joshua and Caleb. Because see, if the men of war were weak, that nation was vulnerable. That nation could easily be wiped out, because they were the first line of defense. And if you read even in history, when armies came to conquer other nations or went to battle, they usually killed the men and enslaved the women and the children. And if they kept any of the males alive, usually it was the children, like the male children, because they could program the male children. But as far as like the men of war, a lot of times the men were killed. So that's my understanding of why Yah judged the men of war the way he did. So I found this very interesting, and it just fell on my heart to share this understanding that I share this, but a newer understanding that I received. It was when I listened to a lesson some years ago, because speaking for myself, that's the narrative that I was taught, that all people, that generation perished in the wilderness save two. But no, it was just a segment, and it was just the men of war. And of course it wasn't only all the men saved Joshua and Caleb. It was just the men of war. So it was not as many perished in the wilderness as we've been led to believe. So I hope you enjoyed this mini lesson, and thank you for watching. And until next time, be blessed.